B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Thursday, May 7th, 2020. You're experiencing a polar vortex. On the East Coast, winter has briefly returned. And on the West Coast, we're sizzling up into the 90-degree range. There's also a fever of activity in Washington, D.C., and that's what we lead with here today. Bill Barr, who was appointed Attorney General after Trump dismissed Jeff Sessions, who was insufficiently loyal because he recused himself from the Russiagate investigation. Well, Bill Barr is a corrupt individual, and he is proving that as Trump wished, Bill Barr is Trump's Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn was the vicious New York lawyer who started out working for Joe McCarthy on the House Un-American Activities Committee, poisoning the nation with the often phony charges of communism back in the 1950s. And Bill Barr, like John Mitchell was to Richard Nixon, he's willing to carry water even if it edges up to breaking the law for the man who he is so loyal to. And today, he proved it once again, because the Justice Department, in a very curious move, announced it is dropping its prosecution of Michael Flynn, Trump's first national security advisor, the only White House official charged during the Russia investigation. Now, this has to be approved by the federal judge who has been trying to pass a sentence on Mike Flynn. But Flynn, who originally pled guilty, switched up lawyers, withdrew his guilty plea, and this whole thing is a very confusing mess. And it's not clear if the judge in the case, who's a pretty hard-liner, is going to comply with the new wishes of the so-called Justice Department. And get this. This led to not a resignation, but one of the Justice Department lawyers who helped lead the Flynn investigation and prosecution from Mueller's office, who's still at the Justice Department, Brandon Van Grack, abruptly has withdrawn from the case. So it remains unclear how this will eventually sort out. But I want to note that Mike Flynn not only pled guilty originally, but we now know through recently released FBI documents, and I reported this last week, that the number two guy to former FBI Director Jim Comey, and that would be Andrew McCabe, the guy who Trump forced out 24 hours or 48 hours before he would have qualified for his pension. Andy McCabe gave a heads up to Mike Flynn. He called the White House and said, "Mike, I'm sending the now infamous Peter Strzok and a couple of other G-men over to talk to you." And Flynn agreed to a scheduled appointment with the FBI team, and when the agents got there, they asked him about whether he had lied about getting calls from the Russian ambassador Kislyak before he had taken the office as national security advisor. And in that phone call, not only did McCabe set up the appointment, but he told Mike Flynn what they were coming to ask him about. Now, typically, you saw St. Bob Mueller, when he wanted to arrest Paul Manafort, he didn't call up and say, "Hey, how's Tuesday afternoon? I'll send a car." No, he rolled up with 20 agents at 6 o'clock in the morning and did a J. Edgar Hoover-style bust. But they didn't do that to Mike Flynn. They were very accommodating. And despite the heads up, the tip-off, Mike Flynn, who should have known better, right? He was a former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He knew about the intercepts and the surveillance of foreigners' phone calls like Ambassador Kislyak. and he would have known. I believe he was on vacation in the Dominican Republic when he either made or took a call from Kislyak. And I've never seen the details of that conversation. But from what I know, they discussed no retaliation by Putin for the Russian sanctions that Obama placed in effect, blaming it on the Russian meddling in the 2016 election as he was leaving the White House. So the idea that Mike Flynn had no clue about the surveillance that he was likely under, and then got the heads up, they come over, and the newly released documents showed that there were discussions with Comey and other top leaders at the FBI. Hey, do we set him up? Or do we give him an opportunity? And in fact, the questioning was so gentle, they tried to remind him of what he said on that phone call. But he insisted on denying that it ever happened. And on my Facebook feed today, as this news broke, some right-wing guy was saying that, this was a frame-up and that Flynn is a victim. And that is purely Trump's talking points. So Flynn has yet to be sentenced and hasn't served any time. He's been fighting to have his case dismissed, saying he was poorly served by his original legal team and framed by investigators. His lawyer also accuses Van Grack of improperly threatening to prosecute Flynn's son, who worked for his father's private consulting firm while it was lobbying for Turkey. And to me, I've said this many times, Mueller gave him a pass on the Turkey connection. $500,000 flowed to Flynn per office during the fall of 2016. Flynn even participated in a meeting where a former CIA director walked out because he was discussing kidnapping the Turkish, whatever he is, imam, or he's exiled in Pennsylvania. His name is Fethullah Gulen. And he's gotten a total pass for that. So I follow Marcy Wheeler on Twitter. And this morning she had a tweet, and it led me to her website. I rarely go there because I think Marcy is a dedicated blogger and an interesting person. But over the last few years, she's shown to be deeply infected with the Russiagate virus. And so I haven't been too interested in her coverage. So what she adds to this is that based on comments from Lindsey Graham related to what they believed was abuse of the FISA court that was limited to the Trump campaign, and Carter Page in particular, and that's false, that the other crime that the FBI was investigating Mike Flynn for occurred before that phone call. It was when he was filling out his form to be reviewed and vetted for the post as National Security Advisor to the Trump administration. And this shows her infection of the virus. Let's quote, "What Lindsey Graham just released to claim there was some kind of FISA abuse suggests that the FBI, which had access to the FISA intercept showing Mike Flynn calling up the country that had just attacked us." That's referring to the election meddling in 2016. And, I don't believe it came anywhere close to an attack. Anyway, that the FBI believed on August 2nd of 2017 that Flynn had not disclosed all of his foreign contacts when he got a security clearance tied to becoming National Security Advisor. And that, of course, was filed in the fall of 2016. So this is just another bizarre corruption of what is left of our system of justice. The gross interference that Trump has engaged in, including repeated discussion of pardoning Mike Flynn even before he was sentenced. And Bill Barr is an active participant in these efforts. And I want to remind you, since I brought up Russiagate and the Justice Department, that an item that got buried a couple of months ago was when Bill Barr moved to dismiss all the charges that had been dramatically made by Bob Mueller during his limited hangout investigation of 13 people who were connected to the troll farm in St. Petersburg, the Internet Research Agency, that was accused of using social media to corrupt Americans and get them to vote to defeat Hillary Clinton in 2016. And this happened because Yevgeny Prigozhin, the Russian oligarch, the guy who controls Concord Management, which runs the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, he used the American legal system and fought back against the charges. And he had the right, and he exercised it, to demand disclosure of all the underlying documents. And that became a real pain in the ass to Mueller and his whole team. And so Bill Barr has quietly just dismissed all those charges because it would be far too embarrassing to go through with an effort at prosecution that would go nowhere anyway, because you're never going to extradite those people and get them to participate, to stand trial. And if convicted, what do you do with them? You would deport them. You wouldn't lock them up in an American prison. Now, also related to the Mueller limited hangout investigation, there does appear to be dirt there that Trump's afraid of, because they have made a last-ditch appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court to block a ruling that requires the Justice Department to give Congress certain secret grand jury material from the Mueller grand jury investigation. At the D.C. Circuit Court, and we're going to mention that again in a moment, they voted to clear the way for Congress to access secret evidence from Mueller's investigation and hand it over to Congress. And Congress says, well, we might impeach him again, and we're using the elevated status of impeachment to demand release of these documents. There is a precedent that the Watergate Commission or committee was given access to grand jury activities during the Nixon impeachment, which was derailed when Tricky Dick resigned. So this is just another interesting spin-off from Russiagate and the fact that Trump is playing defense after declaring that he's been completely exonerated. Well, I await any release of these documents because, as you know, I like to follow the evidence, and if I ever see evidence that shows that there was active connections between Trump, his campaign, and Russian operatives related to the so-called meddling, well, I'd like to see it, and I would be delighted to revise my position if the evidence takes me there. Also, just a quick aside from the Supreme Court, in an unusual unanimous ruling announced today, the court overturned the convictions of two of former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie's minions. These were guys who did his bidding and allowed him to lie about it when they shut down the bridge, the George Washington Bridge, from New Jersey into New York City. And they did it in retaliation against a local mayor who had refused to endorse Christie's re-election. But the opinion, again unanimous, written by Justice Elena Kagan, said that the convictions didn't meet the requirements of the federal law that they were prosecuted under. And I think that's chicken shit because these guys obviously ran a cover-up. Christie obviously lied. And maybe the prosecutor pulled punches by intentionally bringing charges that didn't match the offenses. Okay, so there's one other effort that I think is kind of a ticking time bomb that could lead to an October surprise. And this surfaces in an angry letter from Oregon Democratic Senator Ron Wyden, accusing the State Department of refusing to turn over documents requested by Democrats, even as it turns over rapidly and readily thousands of pages of records to Republican senators who continue to investigate former Vice President Joe Biden and Ukraine. So this could be something that they are working on. We still don't know what Rudy Giuliani's been up to. Bill Barr has the separate investigation with John Durham, a prosecutor from Connecticut, who is trying to find dirt on he's investigating the investigators who opened the investigation initially into Russian connections to the Trump campaign in the summer of 2016. It was called Operation Crossfire Hurricane, if you recall. And so Wyden says that the State Department has not produced any of the documents he requested over 3 months ago. Quote, "It is wholly inappropriate for the State Department to dedicate its limited resources to voluntarily complying with Republican requests without also making a good faith effort to respond to Democratic requests. This is just another example of the deep partisanship and the violation of laws and long-standing practices. And it shows in my view, wall-to-wall corruption of the Trump administration. Now, separately, and here for a moment, you might have a slightly more positive view of Bill Barr, who I've been busy trashing here. Trump reiterated his intention to terminate health care under Obamacare. He wants to completely dismantle the Affordable Care Act. And as you know, I have my issues with it. I prefer Medicare for all. But there are millions of people covered under Obamacare, some who get massive subsidies to reduce the onerous cost of the insurance, and others who are independent contractors or self-employed who get it through these exchanges. And it is one way for people to get covered. And here we are in the middle of a pandemic, which is not over. And Trump continues his partisan approach here. And as you know, in 2016, he said, we're going to repeal and replace Obamacare. The two R's were always there, whether it was coming from him or other Republican leaders. They have never even published a set of bullet points about what they would do to replace Obamacare and to leave so many people high and dry without access to health insurance at a time like this is purely criminal. So Bill Barr, in a meeting at the White House, or I guess it was on Monday, and it's not clear if Trump was there, but Barr made the argument, this is bad politics. Don't do this before the election. And Nancy Pelosi said, quote, the president's insistence on doubling down on his senseless and cruel argument in court to destroy the ACA and every last one of its benefits and protections is unconscionable, particularly in the middle of a pandemic. Now, she refers to the legal action that has been advanced by a federal district court judge in Texas. They shopped for a judge who would rule in their favor. But that's not likely to come up before the Supreme Court until next year, well after the November election. So this is another fascinating and just downright dirty move by Trump. And I mentioned the Second District Court of Appeals, the D.C. Circuit Court. That's where Mitch McConnell's buddy and young crony Justin Walker has been appointed and is facing confirmation. And in the hearings yesterday, young Mr. Walker had to defend his comments in a speech that occurred this March as he sat on a district court bench in Kentucky that reflected that he was opposed to the Affordable Care Act. Now, he says he was unabashed in his defense of the rule of law, and when questioned, he told senators today that he, would observe or honor the precedent set by the Supreme Court in that 5-4 decision where Chief Justice Roberts upheld Obamacare as constitutional. But today, it was yesterday, he had to defend his comments going back to 2012 that the SCOTUS decision upholding the Affordable Care Act was indefensible. And he said that he was referring to the legal analysis of the Supreme Court's ruling, not the substance of the law itself. But these are the kind of dodges that you get from people when they're being confirmed, whether they're Democratic appointees or Republican. They dance around any controversial issue. They say, well, you know, Senator, I may have to rule on that in the future on the court, so I'm not going to comment. But also, as recently as March, when this young man, Walker, was celebrating his appointment in a ceremonial swearing-in event in Kentucky, well, in his speech, he attacked critics of the conservative legal movement. And look at how he identifies himself. In Brett Kavanaugh's America, we will not surrender while you wage war on our work or our cause or our hope or our dream. Bring on the beer. Because Brett likes beer. In another, really bizarre attempt to confirm a dangerous Republican appointee to an agency that he has spent his career opposing, the Senate Rules Committee today voted along party lines to move forward on the confirmation of conservative Texas lawyer James E. Trey Traynor III. Now, this would be to the Federal Elections Commission, which is a toothless body. But as Amy Klobuchar, senator from Minnesota, pointed out, this is another breach of precedent. Because in order to try to keep the Federal Election Commission balanced and, offset partisanship, they typically appointed one Democrat and one Republican at a time. Now, this commission has been further hobbled. It's been ineffective for a long time, but it was further hobbled by the fact that they lost a commissioner last year and have unable to meet or conduct any actions, including enforcement actions, because they don't have a quorum. So now they're going to get a quorum, but it will be, 2 Republicans, 1 Independent, and 1 Democrat. A couple of days ago, I first heard the howls of outrage from people like me who had put themselves on the line to defend Congresswoman Ilhan Omar when, in a tweet, she criticized AIPAC, which should register as a foreign lobby. It's the American Israel Political Affairs Committee. And they have outsized influence in Washington, not because the organization itself donates to political candidates, but because they coordinate the actions of their members who buy politicians in that manner. And you'll remember that she said in that tweet that it's all about the Benjamins, baby. She's been a sharp critic of AIPAC, appropriately. And she also has generally opposed the use of sanctions. But this week, Ilhan Omar signed on to a letter circulated by AIPAC that supports this hypocritical move by Mike Pompeo and the U.S. State Department. They are invoking some of the elements of the six-nation deal with Iran over its nuclear intentions, which the United States has breached and tried to scuttle, in an effort to maintain an arms embargo on Iran. And they believe, yes, they can have it both ways. It is incoherent, it's insulting, and this doesn't relate to Iran getting access to nuclear materials. It's just the usual guns and bombs that the U.S. is number one in marketing all over the world. And so the U.S. has ramped up sanctions of every kind against Iran. We're truly hurting the population there. And so, at the same time, Israel is escalating its direct attacks against Iran-allied forces in Syria. So, I'm quoting here from the Electronic Intifada's report. In other words, Omar has signed on to a letter whose goal is to preserve and protect American empire and shore up its reactionary and undemocratic client states in the region. The letter endorsed by Omar and others asserts that Iran's illicit transfers of weapons directly contribute to some of the most destabilizing threats to the U.S. and our partners in the Middle East, such as Israel and the Gulf states. Now, this is really disturbing. The letter also calls for direct sanctions against Esmail Ghani, the Iranian general who has been promoted to replace the General Qasem Soleimani, who we murdered when he arrived in Baghdad this past January. And so Omar's signature is really shocking. And her office kind of waves it away, saying, we looked at it. We didn't have any problem with it. We just went ahead and approved it. And this is despite a Democratic colleague from Minnesota who's shown real courage in confronting extreme Zionism, Betty McCollum. Back in February, she called AIPAC a hate group. And so she's got some explaining to do. And in the meantime, I have to say I'm very troubled. Maybe Omar is in a very tight re-election race, and her Republican is playing the Israel card against her, and this is some way of trying to triangulate against that. But her credibility with me is sharply damaged. And then here comes Daniel Pipes opinionating in the New York Times today. He's a neocon, and while he sometimes is critical of some Israeli positions, he supports Trump's plan. He is, pretty much a strong supporter of even the Netanyahu government in Israel. And he writes for 6 different reasons that annexing the West Bank would hurt Israel. And he writes, Trump could well erupt in fury at Israel for unilaterally taking the step of annexation. The Jared Kushner plan permits Israelis to annex about 30% of the West Bank, but it's conditioned on Israel agreeing to negotiate with the Palestinians. Now, I think Pipes is wrong about that. I don't think Trump will pipe up at all. Oh, sorry, Pipes. I don't think that he will object in any way. He says, second, annexation would alienate and weaken Israel's diminishing number of friends in the Democratic Party and in Europe. Oh, I kind of doubt that. I mean, there may be 30 people in the Democratic caucus in the House who don't oppose boycott, divestment, and sanction, and who do oppose annexation of the West Bank. That number could be off. It's a ballpark figure from me. But Nancy Pelosi and people like Eliot Engel, who runs the Foreign Affairs Committee, they're not going to object to annexation. Pipes continues, third, as a threat from Iran has grown in recent years, the Israeli government has managed to expand its ties with the Sunni Arab states. It could offend them. Fourth, and this is way down his list, right? Annexation would most likely lead to Palestinian fury that could well destabilize Jordan, the West Bank, and Gaza. Number 5, it will alienate Israel's left. And number 6, it will make more Palestinians eligible to become citizens of Israel. And that threatens the de facto apartheid policies that are in effect today. I don't generally cover, local crimes and murders and things like that. But we're seeing rising national outrage, and it's appropriate, to the videotaped, somebody had a smartphone out, broad daylight murder of a black man, in Brunswick, Georgia. And Ahmaud Arbery was out for a jog. And these 2 white guys, the father and son, and the father has ties to law enforcement. He's a former police detective and a former district attorney investigator in the county there. So let me be as fair as I can. It appears that the white father and son mistakenly thought that Arbery was a suspect in a recent incident. So he's jogging down the street, They're in a pickup truck. One of them is driving, and one of them is back in the bed, the pickup truck bed. They're both armed, and they confront Arbery. Now, they did make calls to 911 as they were engaging in this vigilante activity. And as the video clearly and painfully shows, one of them, I can't tell from my viewing of the video whether it was the father or son, but one of them jumped out of the cab of the pickup and confronted Arbery with either a shotgun or a rifle. And Arbery didn't just, throw up his hands and submit. He responded by trying to grab the gun. And so, in the exchange of gunfire, Arbery was killed. And some of his defenders are now calling this a lynching. That may be so. There's been a delay. This happened way back in February. And officials just tried to kind of, ignore it. But because of the surfacing of the video and now the reports of the 2 911 calls, they're making noises about impaneling a grand jury. I'll believe it when I see it. Today I'm releasing to my subscribers my interview from Earth Day of a man who I deeply admire. He's one of my personal heroes. Former Congressman and former Republican Pete McCloskey. He's now 93, retired on a ranch up above Sacramento. But he served in Congress for 15 years. And he ran against Richard Nixon in the Republican primaries due to his opposition to the Vietnam War in 1972. And Pete wasn't popular with Republicans because before that, he was one of the driving forces in Washington who helped found Earth Day. And in my interview and in his new book, which is a nice small book called The Story of the First Earth Day, How Grassroots Activism Can Change Our World, McCloskey explains that it was part of a bigger movement. And it led to a political effort that took out 5 members of the House and Senate in the fall of 1970. So it's a fascinating backstory that I really didn't have the details on until I read his book. Here's an excerpt from my conversation with Pete McCloskey.
And the result was an incredible impact on politicians. Congress convened in January 1971, and 2/3 of the House and Senate in both parties were saying, we're now environmentalists. Nobody had knocked out 7 incumbents in 20 years. And these were old-timers. In any event, that led to 10 years of probably the finest legislation of all time. We passed the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, Coastal Zone Protection, Marine Mammals Protection. And it was mostly bipartisan.
That's Pete McCloskey. The interview is available for my subscribers today at peterbcollins.com. Tune in, iTunes, Spreaker, and Stitcher. As you know, we have launched the Peter B. Collins Podcast Community Fund, and I have a person who's going to receive a $100 grant today. But I first need to acknowledge a very generous contribution to the fund from our longtime listener and a guy who gives a really good argument, John Zwiebel in Hawaii. And I have to apologize to John because he doesn't like PayPal, so he uses a check writing service. And he's a regular monthly supporter, $10 a month, and I'm grateful for that. But when his checks come in, I don't always open them. I just put them in my check folder. And when the folder gets thick enough, I go to the bank and make a deposit. Well, John surprised me with a check in the middle of April, and I only opened it today. And it's a $500 contribution to our community fund. So, John, I'm a little bit embarrassed. I didn't take the time to open your envelope. And he prodded me today with an email. Hey, dude, there's a check sitting in your P.O. box. It hasn't cleared the bank. So I'm happy to share that embarrassing story with you. And today's recipient of a $100 grant is the Taylor family in Los Angeles. The father, Dan, writes, saying that my wife, Agnes, our 12-year-old daughter, Isabel, and 14-year-old son, Oliver, have hit hard times. I work in the television and motion picture industry. My wife is a homemaker. Our children are in middle school. Normally, the single income I generate is sufficient to cover our monthly expenses. But even though we live a frugal lifestyle, there isn't much left over at the end of the month to put aside for rainy days. Well, he says it's pouring right now. The industry has shut down all production, and until a blueprint for safe return is developed, there will be no work in Hollywood. And I can imagine that listeners all over the country hear Hollywood, and they think, everybody's Tom Cruise and Bill Maher and Jay Leno with, 200 cars and a mansion in Bel Air. But there are a lot of hard-working people in the movie industry. And when I was serving on my national union board, AFTRA, I met a lot of those people. And I have plenty of friends who work in IATSE and the other craft unions that really do the hard work to make movies and TV shows. So he said, look, as long as the virus continues, my unemployment checks will remain my family's only source of income. And in a follow-up, he did confirm that he has started to get the $600 a week federal boost. And I know that makes a big difference. But he says, in L.A., for a family of 4, with mortgage payments, car loans, utility, and food expenses, well, unemployment isn't much. He said, we try to accept all types of odd jobs in our community. To do our share in our neighborhood, we shop for elderly neighbors who cannot or are too endangered to do their own errands. And so, Dan Taylor, I wish you and your family all the best, and you'll be receiving a $100 check from our community fund in the mail in the next few days. Here is our daily coronavirus update, edited by Linda Lewis. Worldwide, the death count is at 267,000. In the United States, it's moving up sharply every day. 75,000 is the attributed COVID-related deaths today. She notes that a member of the U.S. Navy who serves as a White House personal valet to Trump has tested positive for coronavirus. CNN reported today raising concerns about Trump's exposure. They gave him another one of those instant tests, and they tell us he tested negative. And one of these valets began exhibiting symptoms yesterday, CNN says, citing anonymous sources. In a move that has confounded many people, there's been a document created by the CDC attempting to help governors and people in the states all across the country see some sort of a uniform recommended way of reopening the economy, putting people back to work, while trying to reduce transmission of COVID-19. It's a 17-page report. It was finalized last Friday and delivered to the White House. And Mark Meadows, the new chief of staff, the far-right Tea Party Freedom Caucus guy who quit Congress to join the Trump White House, he said, oh, no, we're going to shelve it. And it is believed that because it had recommendations that related to churches and that it was overly detailed, according to Republican sources, that it is not being released. Maybe they're going to revise it. But I heard Rush Limbaugh railing about this morning. And he is saying, the states don't need this guidance. People don't need to know how to reopen their businesses. He just completely dismissed it. And these were not regulations. These were recommendations. But as we'll get to a little bit further down in the stack, this flies in the face of Trump's effort to create the illusion that it's all behind us. Everything's going to be great. Nobody else, maybe a few people will die, and that's really sad, but he is just hell-bent on trying to rebuild the economy. So we're also seeing an orchestrated effort to provide liability exemptions, safe harbor regulations for companies that reopen and that may face lawsuits when people get sick and die from exposure on their premises or due to their products. And get this. The Republicans have drafted legislation, or maybe K Street lobbyists have, that say, well, look, if you follow the CDC guidelines, you're going to be exempt from any of these lawsuits. You'll be protected. But if you don't release the CDC guidelines, well, that's what we call a catch-22. This is a little bit alarming. First I've heard of it, a memo released by the U.S. Military Entrance Processing Command, MEPCOM, states that a past COVID-19 diagnosis obtained during a medical history interview or exam and confirmed by a lab or clinician diagnosis is permanently disqualifying for future military service. Really? I don't know how you explain that. Also, Linda reports that you recall that Senate Intelligence Chair Richard Burr, who is not running for re-election, that he dumped a bunch of shares after he learned about the extent of the pandemic. This was back in February. Well, according to Axios, and I guess the originator was ProPublica, Burr's brother-in-law, Gerald Fouth, dumped up to $280,000 in shares on the very same day as the senator. So, insider trading, access to confidential information used to profit or protect your own financial interests. There's no end to the levels of corruption we see in Washington. Remember how Trump was going to drain the swamp? Here in California, Governor Newsom signed an executive order making workers' compensation benefits available to essential workers who have contracted COVID-19. It creates a limited-time rebuttal presumption to allow people who had to work outside of their homes during the stay-at-home order and contracted the coronavirus. It gives them access to the compensation benefits, which are generally higher than unemployment. And Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, who is one of those who has prematurely reopened his state, after Dallas salon owner Shelley Luther arrogantly ignored or refused to close her business under the limited orders that had been put in place, she has been sentenced to serve a 7-day jail sentence for violating the statewide orders because she reopened about 2 weeks before the official lifting of the restrictions. But Governor Abbott said that he is going to modify his order to make sure that there is no punishment like confinement for violators of his own order. I want to invite you to follow the link in the show file for today's podcast over to the New York Times for a very interesting article that is illustrated with interactive graphics that depict state-by-state conditions. And they conclude that most states that are reopening fail to meet the White House guidelines that Trump read from a script when he was doing his daily attack briefings. This one was several weeks ago. It was back in April. And what it shows is that most states that are reopening fail to adhere to even the recommendations that Trump had put in place. You know, fewer hospitalizations, a downward trend in infections. Now, some of this is complicated because we're doing more testing and it's revealing more infections. But still, it just is amazing that Trump went through the motions of establishing these standards and then encouraged Republican states, at least, to put people's lives at risk by reopening prematurely. Now, I do not condone the gathering of smartphone location data. Nevertheless, it exists, and researchers at the University of Maryland took a look at traffic in and out of Georgia after the illegitimate governor, Brian Kemp, announced he was lifting restrictions there so that hair salons and tattoo parlors and massage parlors could reopen because they're so essential. And what they have learned is that traffic from 4 adjacent states, Alabama, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Florida, led to a daily average of over 500,000 people traveling into Georgia from the neighboring states. It's stunning. And this is how it's just so incoherent, because by never establishing a national stay-at-home, even a recommendation, and then Trump said that he alone had the authority to lift it. Now, of course, he denies that because it's politically convenient to blame governors who do or don't. Remember, he initially criticized Brian Kemp. I think it's a little too early, Bri. And the Times also profiles a woman in Iowa. She had a part-time job at a local joint where she made pizzas and ran a cash register. She's 64 years old. And the point is here that since Iowa never had a ban, but now they've lifted it, she will soon enough be cut off from the meager unemployment benefit that she gets. And it's not just the meat packers who've been ordered by Trump to keep those slaughterhouses open. It's little people at the bottom of the employment chain and the economic ladder who are forced to choose between the small paycheck that helps her make ends meet together with some Social Security and facing even just her fears, if not the reality of the potential risk that she's taking. Here in California, Governor Newsom, in one of his executive orders, made sure that people who work in warehouses where food is stored or shipped from, which would include Amazon workers, are entitled to 2 weeks of paid sick leave. Now, Amazon temporarily extended that, but they cut it off at the end of April. And now they are saying that the California order doesn't apply to them. And workers are fighting back, saying we are entitled to 2 weeks sick leave under certain conditions, and the company is openly contemptuous of the California order. In another predictable shortfall, the Small Business Administration got a mere $50 billion to recharge its fund for disaster relief. And now they have quietly shut down any new applications and limited these loans, which I do believe have to be repaid with interest. The original ceiling was $2 million. It's now $150,000. Now, this is not a surprise. We've known for some time that African Americans are more affected in terms of infections, hospitalizations, and death from the coronavirus than white citizens are. And the numbers show that in some localities, more than half of the cases and 60% of the deaths affect African Americans. So I wanted to also add that there is a new study, I got to turn the page here, from the United Kingdom. And they have a substantial minority population there, many who came from colonies of the former British Empire. Black people in England and Wales are twice as likely to die from the coronavirus as white people, even accounting for differences in class and some underlying health measures. And we have to at least speculate that one of the reasons that Trump and others think that it's okay to reopen is that blacks and seniors, particularly in nursing homes and assisted living, they comprise a huge percentage of the people who get sick and die. They are not, as Hillary called them, deplorables. They are expendables. Also, a new study shows that the wave of infections came from New York and spread across the country, including to Louisiana, Texas, Arizona, and the West Coast. An epidemiologist at Yale, Nathan Grubaugh, quote, "We now have enough data to feel pretty confident that New York was the primary gateway for the rest of the country." And I knew that it was a major gateway, but I didn't think it was primary. Most samples taken in Texas, Ohio, Louisiana, Idaho, Wisconsin, and many other states carry distinct mutations that can be traced back to viruses introduced into New York. Overall, infections spreading from New York account for 60 to 65% of the sequenced viruses found across the country. Now, you've heard a lot about Dr. Fauci's excitement over remdesivir, and this is a drug that's now owned by Gilead, the profiteering biotech company based here in San Francisco. Gilead profiteered off their hepatitis C drug. Well, Public Citizen reminds us that over $70 million in taxpayer dollars were given to Gilead and perhaps other researchers to develop this drug. So we should own it, right? And Gilead has generously said they're giving away a couple of million doses, and they are remarkably silent on their pricing strategy after that. And I'll just mention I looked up and confirmed that Donald Rumsfeld, the former defense secretary who led his little army into Iraq, he is a former director of on the board of Gilead and is said to own as much as $25 million in their shares. Now I want to get to a think piece that I referenced earlier, and I was really struck by this. It's under the byline of Greg Sargent at the Washington Post. He says, on one front after another, Trump is prioritizing his efforts to create the illusion that the country is returning to normalcy after taking concrete steps that might make that actually happen safely. And he says, perversely enough, this is making the outcome less likely. Put another way, he says, Trump prizes his magical reality-bending powers so highly that he'd rather rely on them to deliver him re-election because he fears taking the governing steps necessary to get us back to normalcy will render his election less likely. The real-world consequences, and I'll insert deaths, are not considered. He goes on, this strange dynamic is thrust upon us by a remarkable new AP scoop, which reports that Trump is deliberately refraining from wearing a mask in public because he thinks it will damage him politically. Quote, Trump has told advisors he believes wearing one could send the wrong message. The president said doing so would make it seem like he's preoccupied with health instead of focused on reopening the nation's economy. Moreover, Trump is known to be especially cognizant of his appearance on television, and he told people he fears that he'd look ridiculous in a mask and that the image would appear in negative ads. Oh, yeah. It's all about the optics, Don. So I think it's a good piece. Recommend there's more in it. You can follow the link at peterbcollins.com and read the whole article. I just want to read a few headlines here because I believe we're going corona crazy. In Washington State, where one of the first outbreaks occurred, health officials have warned residents against holding so-called coronavirus parties. These are people who intentionally go to parties with others who they know are carrying the virus. They are trying to catch it. They believe in herd immunity. And I guess they are so convinced of their own invulnerability that they think, well, I'll just party down with some sick people and hope that I get a mild case. And then they believe, of course, that they will be immune. But due to mutations and the lack of any evidence that having the virus makes you immune to being further infected, these people are taking a terrible risk. We have more people going postal. 2 employees at a McDonald's in Oklahoma City were shot, a third injured, after a woman became angry after learning she was not allowed to dine inside the restaurant. She had to take her egg and muffin and eat it somewhere else. So she resorted to her Second Amendment remedies. And you already know about this gruesome case in Flint, Michigan, a black-on-black crime where the African-American security guard at one of those cruddy dollar stores. I go to a dollar store occasionally and get stuff. But 43-year-old Calvin Moonerlin, the father of 9, he was shot and killed because a woman who tried to go into the store and didn't want her daughter, or tried to object to him requiring her daughter to wear a mask. She left and came back with her husband and son. And the son shot and killed the security guard. The father and son remain at large, and the woman has been arraigned on murder charges. But there is a bit of a silver lining, or at least a humanitarian story here, because over 10,000 people have contributed to a crowdfunding campaign with a goal of raising $10,000. And as of Wednesday, they have raised $352,000. Well, in a difficult context, that is a little bit heartwarming. And I thank Merle Kyle in the Detroit suburb of Royal Oak, who keeps me up to date on news in Michigan. And finally today, if you'll indulge me, I want to share with you a recent exchange I had on Facebook, because I find it so discouraging. And it leaves me despondent about the future of the Democratic Party, about the people who blindly support Joe Biden and think that he is going to prevail against Trump in November, and that things like the Ukraine story, the ticking time bomb I referred to earlier, and the Tara Reade allegations, whether they're true or not, that are going to be used to try to bring him down. And so this exchange started with a guy named Richard Robinson, who I used to work on political campaigns with. He is an excellent political spinmeister. So he put up a post, an article from Salon, with the headline, Biden supporters demand that MSNBC fire Chris Hayes for covering Tara Reade's sexual assault allegation, for covering it. And so he said, I don't really want Chris Hayes fired, but his coverage was inaccurate and unfair. So I first put up a kind of uncharged question. I said, Rich, please explain how his coverage was inaccurate, unfair, or dishonest. So his first response is, Tara Reade's trumped up, and trumped up is in all caps, Tara Reade's trumped up narrative is full of holes, but don't take my word for it. So he posted this commentary and op-ed from USA Today, which I've referred to on this show, and the first investigative piece by the New York Times that was published on Easter Sunday, which came to no conclusions. It simply covered the denial by Joe Biden and the accusation by Tara Reade. So I responded, Rich, you're just offended that Hayes took a little break from partisan programming and busted the network's blackout of a legitimate news story 2 weeks after the New York Times reported it, lifting their own 30-day blackout on the Reade allegations. Your use of trumped up is just partisan hackery. She has no alliance with him. The USA Today op-ed notes the obvious holes in her narrative, but most Me Too stories have similar weakness, and that didn't stop most Democrats from believing Christine Blasey Ford. And when he tries, the USA Today writer, when he tries to link Reade's unapproved views of Putin to a smear of Bernie Sanders and Russia, he reveals that he's a party hack too. And then I point out the risk of trying to bury your heads in the sand, or put in your earbuds and turn them up loud. I said efforts to suppress this story leave Democrats in the dark about an issue that's already weaponized by Fox, 2,500 mentions of Reade so far, that weaken prospects of beating Trump, whether or not her claims are true. So then, this is the spinmeister, and Rich is really good at it. He responds by saying, "We are in a war against fascists, Peter. Should we take some time out to point to the good things that Hitler has done? Or better yet, should we focus on the American army, which a German Nazi has alleged they committed a war crime, while millions die in crimes against humanity by the Germans and Japanese?" What? And he uses this theme of Nazis, and what I take it is that he supports propaganda, and that Trump gets his propaganda over at Fox and at the One America News or whatever that joint is. Then he suggests that somebody is paying Tara Reade. Who do you think is writing the checks? I don't know who the new Michael Cohen is, but smell the rat? Well, that's a pure projection. And so he shifts from my discussion of reporting and possible journalism being committed by Chris Hayes, which I defend in a narrow way, and all of a sudden, I'm not sufficiently opposed to Nazism. And he closes this thread, this one comment, by saying, "I hope that answers your misguided diatribe." All right, it goes on. I didn't let up. Rich, as I think you know, I'm not a Democrat. I'm an independent progressive and a political commentator who seeks facts and truth without partisan considerations. In your post, you slammed Chris Hayes as inaccurate, unfair, and dishonest. You respond to my comments by reframing it as a war on fascism, which suggests you want propagandist media that fixes the facts around a predetermined view. Paraphrasing Sir Richard Manning's report to Tony Blair on the eve of the invasion of Iraq, which Biden enabled. While Chris Hayes, who I knew when he was a real journalist at The Nation, often peddles the company line, in this case he was not dishonest or unfair, and I defend him. As to Reade, she doesn't have a Gloria Steinem or any other lawyer as far as I know, or a PR team. And I was actually referring to Gloria Allred, but I didn't put the right name in. Anyway, so I don't know how you accuse her of getting checks or smelling a rat. Those are your projections. Then you lament that Republicans are afraid to criticize Trump, and so Biden should get the same treatment, and tag Reade as a lunatic because you've convinced yourself it can't possibly be true. You just want this to go away, and what I'm trying to get through to you is that it's not going away, especially if female voters feel there's a transparent resolution of Reade's claims. Let's empower Anita Hill to conduct an investigation. All right? It goes on. Rich fires back. It is already going away, as Tara Reade has pulled her interviews. And he snarkily says, maybe she will do your show. You have a shot. Now, I would interview her, but I have found her to be a little bit dicey. And I have never argued that her claims are true. I don't know that. But my point is that denying them is not going to help anybody. And Rich goes on, I'm tired of this bullshit. If there's a valid charge, investigate. But if the investigation shows no evidence and a high preponderance that the whole allegation is bullshit, stop beating the dead horse that is only fodder for those who want to hurt. Peter, you are a soldier in this fight against fascism. We all are. Nobody is asking you to be untruthful. Just know thy enemy, and it isn't Biden. All right, we're getting close to the end here. So then somebody I don't know who's a friend of Rich's chimes in. His name's Stephen Feinberg. And he takes the spin, the reframing, and the diversion that Rich employed here and says, Rich, you are speaking factual truth. We are fighting a fascist, and your friend here apparently won't be satisfied. It's something so many so-called progressives find hard to do. They play a game with no end, under the rational sounding seeking the facts independently. But when presented with facts, if it doesn't suit their so-called standards and agenda, and yes, they do have an agenda, then that is not good enough, and the game without end goes on. I've read about the woman. The accusations bothered me at first, as I do believe people should be heard, and the woman has been heard. We can make up our own minds, and I'm glad Joe spoke up and the nasty game is over. Move on. Well, it's not over, Mr. Feinberg. So I respond to Feinberg. I say, you missed the point of my comments under the influence of skillful spinmeister Rich Robinson. I objected to his false comments on the reporting of Chris Hayes. When he couldn't win that argument, he reframed it as a war against fascism that requires Hayes to maintain the blackout on Reid's accusations and just present positive coverage of Biden. Even if you agree with that, it's dangerous to try to propagandize Democrats the way Fox propagandized Republicans. You're free to choose denial, but it won't make the story go away or help Biden win the votes of women he badly needs. So then Rich comes back. See, that is the problem. You're about winning an argument. I am about stopping fascism. Wow. Nuance all the issues you want and stick yourself on a self-righteous corner as the Nazis plunder the nation. Here we go again. I am abetting Nazis by defending Chris Hayes' reporting on Tara Reid. So then I recap it. I say one more time. I disagreed with your claims that Hayes was unfair, inaccurate, and dishonest. You posted articles that do not prove your claims. Then you shifted to your fighting fascism arguments that have zero relevance to my objections to your false claims about Hayes' reporting. And Mr. Feinberg calls your straw man diversion factual truth and says I'm playing a high-minded game. Then you resort to a Nazi metaphor, all because I defended Hayes' reporting the Reid allegations. So I'm going to leave it there. There actually is more. And Feinberg reiterates that I'm a high-minded so-and-so, that this is a battle between Nazis and democracy, that his family escaped from the pogroms, and that just because Rich won't play your game doesn't mean he is wrong or didn't win the argument that will never satisfy you. So, as I mentioned before I started this whole part, it leaves me despondent. Now, I'm getting used to the idea that you never win an argument, you don't persuade people on Facebook or Twitter. But I went to great lengths to try to stick to the original point, and they simply refused. And it's all about defending Biden. And he may be totally innocent of this, but the fact that it's out there means that the Democrats are pushing another damaged candidate, and they believe that through bluster and denial that they can sway enough people and carry the day. And my last submission to you is a poll from Monmouth University. 37% of respondents said an accusation that Biden sexually assaulted Tara Reid was probably true. 32% said it wasn't. 31% said they don't know. 86% are aware of the allegation. It's not going to go away. Trump's people are working on more ads right now. And the denial and the willful effort to change the subject using these bizarre Nazi arguments and a war on fascism, well, it's just really hard to take and impossible to explain. Thanks for listening all the way to the bitter end of my lengthy podcast today. You can share it with anybody, including Rich Robinson. I remain Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.